Virion, let's face it, Virion needs absolutely no introduction. He already did a perfect job of doing it right there, so I'm not gonna ruin that. Virion is the archest of all archers. Unfortunately, that still makes him an archer, and that's really his main problem. As far as archers go though, Virion is easily one of the best in the series, having very good growth rates overall, especially in strength. In particular, his base strength growth is actually quite high for an archer, and it goes up to a respectable 55%, which is, again, very good by archer standards. As you'd expect from an archer though, his skill is completely ridiculous, but as you can see though, that mostly comes from the class. His actual base skill growth isn't as good as his base speed growth, which is his best base growth, but the archer class just adds so much to the base skill that he suddenly has a 70% skill growth, which is definitely pretty good, and again, speed, very good, like you'd expect from an archer. And his caps also lie in those areas, with +2 skill and +2 speed, pretty standard there. No positive modifier to strength, but no negative modifier either, so that's pretty much fine. You might notice that he has no negative modifier to magic as well. I'll talk about that a bit later. Luck is a bit of an issue though, and his defense is quite low, especially that base defense growth, which is very low for a physical type unit, even though his base defense is not that bad. And yes, that's where his weak points are in his caps, -1 luck and -2 defense, so Virion doesn't exactly like getting attacked, really. Something to note about Virion, though, is his base resistance and especially base magic growths are very, very high for someone who starts out primarily as a physical class. And you might think that's completely useless. You're probably thinking of the utterly abysmal Ronan from Fire Emblem 5. For those of you who don't know, Ronan was an archer who had terrible strength, but a really good magic growth, which was kinda pointless. Yeah, he was one of the worst characters in the series, actually. But Virion actually has some use for his magic growth, which we'll be seeing when we get to his class options. But of course, no discussion of Virion could be complete without talking about the fact that he's an archer. Lately, archers have been heavily disliked within the Fire Emblem community. They can't attack on the enemy phase, which is where the vast majority of combat takes place. Well, I mean, they can counterattack if an enemy hits them with a bow, but most of the time, they won't be counterattacking on the enemy phase, and again, that's where most of the fighting takes place, because there are vastly more enemies than there are you. Because of this, archers generally don't kill as much as other classes do. They're best used for either weakening or picking off other enemies from a safe distance, or for taking down enemy flying units, which they are very, very good at. But archers do have the problems of, again, not being able to counterattack in close combat, and relatively bad base stats overall for their class. Archers have among the worst class-based stats in the game. Thankfully though, archers at least do not have horribly gimped movement like they did in Shadow Dragon and New Mystery of the Emblem. Whoever had the idea of giving archers the movement rate of an armored class has some serious explaining to do, because archers were utterly horrible in that game. Thankfully though, that has been fixed. Archers do have the same movement rate as most on-foot units do in this game, which helps them out a lot more, because before, that movement rate was terrible. Archers are, however, and of course Virion, being an archer, is useful for this, archers are much, much more useful on Lunatic Plus difficulty, which is the difficulty mode that you unlock after beating Lunatic for the first time. The reason why they're so much better there is because on that difficulty, random enemies might randomly be given the counter skill. We'll be talking about counter later once we actually see enemies with that skill, but oh boy, counter is possibly the single most irritating skill in the entire game to go up against. It basically results in you taking damage every time you hit the enemy, and a very large amount of damage too. The only way to get around counter is to use a ranged weapon, and for that, archers are great because archers never need to worry about counter at all. So if you're playing Lunatic Plus, well, 1, you're insane, but 2, Virion might actually be very useful to you, because he'll help get around the multitude of very irritating counter enemies. If you're not well, it just depends on how much you like archers. I don't hate them all that much, and because I love Virion's character, I'm probably going to be using him quite a lot in this playthrough. But if you don't, well, that's fine. Virion might not be the one for you. He's probably one of the only characters in this game that some people may consider to be slightly subpar. That is, if you don't like archers, and only if you don't like archers. Really, there are no bad characters in this game, though. Everyone is amazingly good, so again, it all will boil down to his class. And speaking of his class, Virion does have other options besides the Archer class tree, but first let's talk about its skills and promotions. From Archer, he gets skill +2. I've really ignored those skills most of the time because they're pretty pointless outside of the early game. But he does learn Prescience, which is actually somewhat of an interesting skill. It gives hit and avoid +15 during the user's turn. This, as you can tell, is very good for archers because the user's turn is probably the only time they'll ever be attacking, so it's pretty much a flat 15% hit and avoid boost almost all the time, which does definitely help. From there, he can promote to either Sniper or Bow Knight. Sniper is mostly useful for the Bowfair skill, for +5 strength when armed with a bow, which Virion likes using, so that's definitely appreciated. Hit rate +20 though. Seriously, on someone with a skill growth as insane as his and a good skill cap, he is not going to need that hit rate boost at all. Bow Knight, though, is my preferred promotion option for any game where archers have the option to promote to it, because Bow Knights can actually use swords in addition to bows, which means finally they're able to attack in close combat, which makes them immensely more useful than just plain archers. Not only that, but they also gain a mount into the bargain, so they have extra movement. Sniper does have higher stats overall, but personally, I always much prefer the Bow Knight class because being mounted and having swords just outweighs the slight statistical advantage to me. He'll also learn the Bowbreaker skill from this class, and that will be very useful in another one of his class options. Not so much in the actual... Well, I guess if he's engaging in archer duels on the enemy phase with other archers, it could be sort of useful, but his hit rate and avoid rate are pretty good anyway, so it's not really all that much of an issue. I'll actually talk about his third class tree next, because his last one's a bit special, Wyvern Rider. This is the one where I mentioned that Bowbreaker is going to be quite useful, because Wyvern Rider, being a flying class, is weak to bows, so having an extra 50% evasion against bows is very, very useful. But yeah, Wyvern Rider. Funnily enough, the last 3 characters who've joined have all had this class option, so pretty much the exact same things that held for them will hold here. Virion has pretty good strength as a Wyvern Rider, and he'll learn some alright skills, but mainly it's the Breaker skills that are useful from this class tree. Especially Lance Breaker, because it'll help him avoid Beast Killers when he's a Bow Knight or a Dark Knight. Deliverer is not really... I mean, it's decent at giving the movement boost when paired up, but really, Virion doesn't learn all that many skills that benefit from pair up, so it's not as useful as, say, for Frederick or Sully. Now, Virion's last class option is really interesting. It's the Mage line. Now, this is where I said that Virion has a surprisingly high magic growth for a primarily physical unit, but it's actually really good because it means that Virion is one of the few physical characters in the game who doesn't royally suck when reclassed to Mage. In fact, he's actually quite good as a Mage. He might not be as good as some of the ones who start off as mages, but out of all the characters who don't primarily start out as mages, Virion is by far one of the best. He has a respectable 50% magic growth as a mage or sage, and he'll be able to hit decently hard and have pretty nice resistance as well. But the main use of this class tree is one of its promotion options, Dark Knight. Dark Knight is a class that uses both swords and magic. It's a hybrid physical and magical class like Tactician, but it happens to be mounted as well. Now, most people who start off as mages are pretty bad in this class because they usually have terrible strength and defense. Virion, though, from his experience in a physical class, Virion should have pretty decent strength if he ever becomes a Dark Knight. And because of this, Virion can do very well in this class. He'll have decent strength and magic, so he'll be able to hit hard from both the physical and magical sides of the spectrum. He'll be mounted, and Dark Knight has one very good skill and one skill that I personally think is one of the worst in the entire game. The very good skill first, Life Taker. This means that every time that you kill someone on your turn, and it only works once, and it only works on your turn, otherwise it would be horribly broken, you recover 50% of your... I think it's 50% of your max HP, actually. This is a pretty useful skill on just about anyone, so it's a very good skill to have. Of course, he can also promote to Sage and get Tome Affair for an extra +5 magic in when using a magic spell, but I kind of prefer Bow Knight for him. It's not that he's bad as a Sage, it's just that he's pretty good as a Bow Knight, so I would rather not waste that. Virion learns a couple of interesting skill combinations, though. He gets 2 Rally skills, Rally Skill and Rally Magic, so he is okay when using Rally skills, but not exactly the best. He also gets a fairly amusing combination of skills. That one skill that I mentioned in Dark Knight, Slow Burn. One of my least favourite skills in the entire game. It gives a +1 boost to evade and accuracy every turn up until the 15th turn. Seriously though, waiting 15 turns for only a 15% accuracy and evasion bonus is just not worth it. Most chapters will be over by 15 turns. And you can get a +15% chance to accuracy and avoid just off of Prescience, and that activates every time it's your turn. So, you don't really... It's just... I don't really like this skill all that much, it just feels not worth it. But amusingly, Virion is one of the few characters who can learn both it and Slow Burn. Slow Burn is the exact opposite. It starts you off with a 15% accuracy and evasion bonus, and it goes down by 1 each turn until the 15th turn. Personally, I think this is a lot better than Slow Burn, but the real funny thing is what happens if you combine the 2 skills. Since technically speaking they're complete opposites, what does it do? Well, you basically gain a +15% to accuracy and evasion permanently, but it's not worth wasting 2 skill slots on when you can do the same thing with 1 skill slot with Prescience, so it's generally not that good. I mean, it's kind of funny. I like to mention it because it's hilarious, but not worth wasting 2 skill slots on, seriously. One downfall of Virion, though, in the skills department is that he doesn't learn any kind of damage-boosting skills like Astra, Luna, Soul, things like that. And because of that, Virion might be doing quite a bit less damage overall later on in the game. However, early on, he doesn't really have much competition for what he does. In fact, primary bow users are very, very rare in this game. Virion, I think, is actually the only one in the first generation, so if you want a primary archer, Virion is pretty much your only option, at least early on in the game. So he's pretty much the best he is at what he does, but it just depends on whether what he does is appropriate for your purposes. Some people won't like him, some will. It's a bit of a your mileage may vary issue. He is one of the better Dark Knights in the game, though, I will give him that. Virion's voice actor is actually something that I didn't realise until I looked it up, because it is sort of hard to tell because he's putting on an accent. Virion is actually voiced by Dan Warren. He voiced Arthur from Ghosts and Goblins in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but I mainly know him as Igor from the Persona series, and I can't believe I didn't know this sooner. Knowing this just makes Virion that much more amazing. Yeah, it is a bit hard to tell because he is putting on an accent for Virion, but yeah, he's voiced by the guy who voices Igor from the Persona series, which makes him amazing in my book. Dan Warren has also done several audiobooks, which is also amazing.